I want to welcome to the program right now our friend Charles Cook from National Review Online. Charles, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I am good, but I don't live in Massachusetts, so it's a little bit easier to breathe free. I mean, you wrote a piece at National Review yesterday talking about these recommendations, 44 recommendations from a panel of academic experts on how to tighten, in the words of the Boston Globe, the state's gun laws, which the Boston Globe says already considered among the toughest in the country. Now, Charles, they're not tightening the gun laws. These proposals would decimate, I think, due process. I mean, but let's not even talk about the right to keep your arms at first. I mean, there are some scary proposals. As you said last night on Twitter, you don't have to be pro-gun to be adamantly opposed to what this panel's recommending.
There's something about firearms that lobotomizes the political class, and indeed the academic class as well. There's some phobia inherent to the question which makes them recommend and suggest things that in no other circumstance would they even consider. And I think really that's what we're seeing in Massachusetts. The very fact that a year after Sandy Hook they're considering tightening what are among the strictest gun laws in the country, and I should say have nothing to do with what happened at Sandy Hook, is in and of itself worrying. But hidden among the proposals is the suggestion that anybody who has been arrested, not convicted, not even charged, but just arrested at any point, should be denied purchasing a long gun. Now, that is so inimical to the American way of life. Forget firearms, as you say, or as you say, I say. Forget firearms. Completely forget them for a second.
Yeah.
Let's take the amendments one by one. So if you are arrested wrongly, totally wrongly, you're picked up, maybe you look like somebody who is suspected of a crime. Maybe you are picked up on the street by a policeman who thought he had probable cause but did not, and you're taken to a police station. Then you're let go because they got it wrong, because authorities get it wrong. Are we to presume it would be acceptable from that point onward that you lose your right to free speech, to assembly, petition the government for redress of grievances, that you lose your religious rights? Of course not. Would we say to somebody, well, you were arrested 3 years ago, now you've been arrested again, but you don't have the right to a trial because you've been arrested? The Fifth Amendment. Well, if not, why not? The Fifth, Sixth, the Eighth. Can we, unusually and cruelly punish somebody because they've been arrested before? This flies so far in the face of American presumption of innocence and American liberty, I don't even know where to start. And frankly, except that it's been yielded by this bizarre hatred of guns in places like Massachusetts and among the academics who wrote this suggestion, it doesn't have anything to do with guns. It has everything to do with basic liberty.
It does, as you say. I mean, this is the basic concept of, how we define our individual freedoms and how we define the power of the state. It just so happens that guns is the issue in this case, but guns are the issue, and we know that these recommendations are going to get turned into legislative items here. The Boston Globe are reporting that they want this gun control legislation to come before the House in Massachusetts before July. And the report also said, overall, quote, Massachusetts continues to be a leader nationally in efforts to reduce gun violence. The committee believes that even more can be done. It's interesting, Charles, over the last couple of years, the state of Massachusetts has seen a reduction in violent crime. But in the 10 years after the Gun Control Act of 1998, the last big package that passed in Massachusetts, the gun owners actually pointed out that hospitalizations with firearm injuries, gun crimes, all these things went up in the state of Massachusetts. I mean, these academics can talk about Massachusetts being a leader in efforts to reduce gun violence, but if you keep barking up the wrong tree, all those efforts are for naught.
Well, yes, but this is where we run into the usual problem, which is that progressives confuse intentions for outcomes. We saw this, I was on your show talking about this in New York with the SAFE Act, when authorities said that because more people had been prosecuted under the changed terms of the SAFE Act, it was working, which is an entirely insane thing to say.
Right.
But I would say something else. Conservatives need to start playing dirty on this one. There is no doubt whatsoever in my mind that the academics who suggested this have suggested it for no other reason than that they loathe firearms. But if this were a conservative suggesting this in another area, the first thing that the left would do is they would look up the statistics and they would accuse conservatives of racial bias. They'd say this was a sinister attempt to deprive minorities, African Americans, of their rights. I looked up the statistics in Massachusetts last night.
Yeah.
And there are about 7 to 3 white to black arrests. So given the general population of Massachusetts is not 7 to 3, blacks are disproportionately arrested in Massachusetts, as they are in much of the rest of the country. Now, you can make a case, if you're cynical enough, to say, as the left does on everything is similar, you can make a case and say, well, okay, all you're trying to do here is take away guns from black people, as the gun control movement has throughout most of American history up until maybe 1970. I think conservatives need to start pointing out the real-world impact this would have. I mean, as we know, African Americans especially are arrested at a very, very high rate, and African Americans are also disproportionately poor. So you pass a law, for whatever reason, that says that anybody who's ever been arrested but not charged or convicted can no longer buy a gun. You're essentially condemning poor people to a lack of self-defense.
Especially when you tack on to that. I mean, that's one part of it, but then the other part are these, we've talked about this before, Charles, I mean, the hundreds of dollars in fees and in taxes that it takes to apply to exercise your right, which also makes it difficult, if not impossible, for economically disadvantaged Americans to again, exercise a fundamental individual right of self-defense in their home.
Yes. And I want to make this very clear, just in case, that there is no question in my mind, as I say, this is not the intention of the panel or the legislature. I'm not going to play the game that progressives play on this and suggest that that's the hidden, sinister motive. It's not. But that is the consequence. And I've been thinking about this a little bit myself recently, living where I do, where you have to buy a permit, get a permit to buy a gun. It really is one thing to have to get a permit to conceal a gun. Personally, I'm a constitutional carry guy, but that is one thing. But when it takes as long as it does where I live to get a permit just to buy a gun, you are really, after a point, denying people their rights. And if you're a single mother in a dangerous neighborhood and you have to wait 4 months to get a permit to buy a gun, and you have a child at home, are you going to do that, or are you going to walk out onto the street and buy one? There does come a point at which these sorts of laws not only restrict people's rights, but become counterproductive. And I'm thinking of people in Massachusetts who have done nothing wrong and who live in dangerous areas and have been arrested and not charged and not convicted and are told you can't buy one, and who will just go to the street corner and do that because their life depends on it. And it's much better for them to have a sense of protection than it is to be right with the law.
You know, it is interesting, Charles, because I don't know what the panel recommendations will be for those who, you know, were to be in possession of a firearm without a license in Massachusetts. But we just saw a self-defense case in Chicago where a guy is at home with his 18-year-old daughter. She comes to him yesterday, I think it was yesterday morning, maybe the day before, and said, you know, I think there's somebody trying to break into the apartment. He's on crutches. He goes and looks, doesn't see anybody, goes back, gets his gun. 2 guys come into the apartment. He has to shoot and kill one of them. The other one turns and runs. Chicago police come out. Case of self-defense wouldn't be an issue, except that this guy had an expired firearm owner identification card. So he's now been arrested. He's been charged. It's a misdemeanor. And at that point, Charles, I mean, you have to wonder, like, what is this misdemeanor going to do? It's gonna, you know, it could cause serious trouble for this guy. I'm sure this guy doesn't want to even have a misdemeanor crime on his record. But what did he do? He had a firearm that he legally purchased, that he had lawfully owned. He didn't have a valid permit to own that firearm, but it didn't make him any less safe, right? In fact, you know, that firearm was still vitally useful in saving his life and his daughter's life, but he's now facing a charge for not having that permit. Again, I'm right there with you, man. I've never lived in a state where I've had to have a permit to own a gun, and it drives me crazy to hear about these laws. Charles, that music means we're out of time. I wish we could spend more time with you, but we'll talk again very soon.
Absolutely, looking forward to it.
All right, Charles Cook from National Review Online joining us.